Joining us now live here in studio is Congressman Adam Schiff. He is the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. And thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
So in July of this year, before President Trump went to go have his Putin summit, 3 or 4 days before that summit, the Justice Department unsealed this massive indictment against a dozen Russian military intelligence officers, charging them in detail with having attacked our election in 2016. Common wisdom at the time said, with this indictment unsealed immediately before the president takes that trip, he can confront Putin with that. He can demand the extradition of those officers. He can make this a real issue. None of that happened. Now, 3 days before John Bolton went to Moscow today, we saw the unsealing of another indictment against another Russian, charging that that same criminal effort is still underway now and has been underway for years and is directed by oligarchs close to the Russian government. I think the common wisdom, again, was that John Bolton, with that newly unsealed indictment, would have to bring it up, would have to confront the Russians about this. He couldn't not. Again, the common wisdom is wrong. I feel like I'm watching an incredibly dramatic situation here, teed up by the Justice Department and blown off by the White House. How do you see it?
I see it much the same way. It's really breathtaking. When the ink was barely dry on the latest indictment of a Russian working for an oligarch, as you say, close to Putin, we have this spectacle of the National Security Advisor of the United States basically telling his counterparts, you know, that interference you did in the last election, I don't really think it did very much. Basically communicating to Putin. Putin has to walk away from this thinking, this weak U.S. president will never confront me. He doesn't have the guts to confront me. This National Security Advisor certainly doesn't. I have essentially carte blanche in the midterms. As long as what I do helps the president's party, he will not only not call me out, he may be grateful for it. That's basically the message that John Bolton delivered. And it is so damaging to the national interest. It's breathtaking. When this latest indictment was unsealed, the first thing that I noticed about it was that it had been held for a while, that the documents that we were looking at, the affidavit from the FBI agent that was essentially the narrative summary of the criminal information for that case, that was from a while ago. It was from a few days ago. This is all unsealed at a time essentially of the Justice Department's choosing. It happens on the same day that we get a joint statement from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security, talking about the seriousness of Russian efforts and other international efforts to influence our election. I feel like we're having a little bit of a replay of October 2016, when Homeland Security and the FBI, or Homeland Security and intelligence agencies, among others, are sort of signaling that there's a problem here, that Americans need to be paying attention, there's something wrong. And once again, in this case, we see the Trump administration now saying, don't pay any attention to that. It's really worse than 2016, because in 2016, you had the administration officials release that statement in October saying, you know, the Russians are meddling in our election. And you had a president who privately, President Obama, had told Putin, essentially, we know what you're doing, you better knock it off. Now, they didn't, but that was the message that he delivered. This time, we have agency heads making the same warning, essentially, saying the Russians are still messing around with us. We have an indictment that follows that up. And instead, the message from our president and his national security advisor is, we don't believe our intelligence agencies, and we don't really take seriously what you did in our last election. And what's more, we're not really going to confront you over what you might do in the next election. So we have a president and his staff that are working at counter purposes to our intelligence agency, and certainly at counter interest to our Justice Department and the American public interest. And that is just staggering. Is there, with that kind of leadership, with that being the stance of the president and his national security advisor, do you think that that essentially functions as a directive to the intelligence agencies and to law enforcement at the federal level in terms of actually fighting these efforts? I mean, we were all fairly shocked early on in the Trump administration when National Security Agency director, the director of the National Security Agency, said he had not been directed as head of the NSA to try to fight any ongoing efforts by the Kremlin to influence our politics. We now know from this latest indictment that, in fact, this effort run by Prigozhin through the Internet Research Agency and these other elements of this Russian government-directed
interference campaign, they didn't slow down after 2016. They kept right up and, in fact, started scaling up their efforts and spending even more money to try to influence American voters and American politics in 2017 and into 2018. With this sort of leadership, are you worried that the intelligence agencies aren't doing what they can to keep us safe?
Well, they're certainly not going to win any points with this president for warning of the Russian threat, doing things about the Russian threat. But nonetheless, they're professionals. They're doing their job. The Justice Department did its job. It indicted this Russian woman for meddling in the most ugly, divisive messages that the Russians could imagine. But they're not going to win any plaudits from this president for doing it. The only real deterrent, I think, that we have with the Russians, because they're getting this green light, essentially, from our President National Security Advisor, the only real deterrent we have is the Russians have everything they could want in Donald Trump. They have the perfect U.S. president, one who is picking on NATO and belittling our allies and giving them cover. Why mess with that? Why cross a red line that would force the Congress to override the president when they have everything they want with Donald Trump? That may be the only deterrent we have in terms of election meddling, and we have to hope that's going to be powerful enough.
Congressman Adam Schiff, top Democrat.